Fredo, it's great to see you today.
Great to see you, Jason. Thank you for having me.
So, Fredo, you've spent decades studying Russia. In fact, you've lived in Russia, you've traveled to Russia, you spent years going there, and you were earlier at Harvard studying Russia. But today, what do we see going on? A lot of people are saying that the Russians want to negotiate, others are saying that they don't, and others are saying right now Putin maybe really wants to negotiate. What do you think?
Well, one thing is what Putin wants, another thing is what he may have to do. I guess we have to separate it like that. Of course, the war, we all know, is not going well for him, even though he thinks he is winning, whatever. We will see how the different factors combine, and tomorrow's a big day. Of course, when Trump and Putin will talk on the phone, and let's see what Trump comes back with. I'm just kind of counting the minutes to see that. But at the end of the day, Putin will have to, if he knows what's good for him, will have to cede a lot of his maximalist demands, I think, because Ukraine has, fortunately, the option to walk out of these negotiations or delay, obfuscate. I mean, they can play that game as well.
So, Putin as a person, you've spent a lot of years looking at. In fact, you've written a number of papers about Vladimir Putin and his personality type. How do you think it is that Putin himself perceives the situation? What's driving him?
Absolutely. Well, as you mentioned, 4 years ago, I published together with Dr. J. Michael Waller a paper, excuse me, the Center for Security Policy in Washington, a think tank, profiling Putin's psychology. And it's very different than most other psychologists, psychoanalysts, psychiatrists that have analyzed Putin, some of them even in your program. Our paper is very different, and there's a reason for that. It just happens coincidentally, serendipity, that both my parents, erudites in psychology, my mother was a PhD, taught at the university in Mexico City many years. My father wrote numerous books on psychology, and they focused on one personality type that fits Putin's personality perfectly, I would say, almost perfectly. In fact, there are 21 symptoms of this personality type that my parents counseled for years, decades, in Mexico. And Putin fits 20 out of the 21 like a glove. It's almost like Putin is trying very hard to fit that personality type. And it's called internalized homophobia. And so we know Putin has problems with that issue. You know, it is an issue for him. The original writer, in Russian, they call him Первый открыватель, of course, a pioneer of that, studying that personality type. His name was Edmund Bergler. And it just happens that I have a couple of his books here. Edmund Bergler was, an Austrian psychoanalyst who studied directly under Sigmund Freud and stayed loyal to Freud, unlike people like Carl Jung or others who broke with Freud. But Bergler, if you look at these books, you see practically on every page Vladimir Putin. And there are again 21 symptoms of this pathology, and they suffer a lot. These people suffer a lot, and Putin, you can tell, has inner torments. Bergler, in fact, used the phrase "inner hell." Every day they're tormented since youth, and so Putin, I believe. We need to study that part of his psychology if we are to understand what makes him tick. And that's why I've written other papers as well. Not only that, 35-page paper for the Center for Security Policy on Putin's psychology, but also other papers on the ramifications on dealing with people that suffer from internalized homophobia. And one of the more relevant, Jason, is their masochism. So in every page of of Bergler's books, but also what my father wrote, also what my mother noticed by counseling these people in their very troubled lives, and then going on to teach at the university in her class on abnormal psychology. Masochism. They're always provoking, always provoking, always provoking in order to get punished. They enjoy the punishment because for them and their mind and very twisted mind, the poor things grew up in a very challenging environment where they grew up. And so for them, being punished, it's almost like being loved. In fact, one of my mother's patients, when she was saying, well, why do you stay with that very abusive relationship? Why do you stay with that very abusive man? And you've just described how he abuses you. He answered something I'll never forget because he actually became almost part of the family. Some of these people disappeared. I never saw them again, but others would come back and, we would invite them and stuff. And my mother would talk about them, their lives, whatever. And this was one of them. And he answered something. I mean, you speak fluent Spanish, Jason, and he said, me maltrata porque me quiere. He mistreats me because he loves me, which is interesting. I believe deep down that Putin is this personality type. It just fits better than every other theory I've seen out there. But also how to handle him. I think he's provoking, 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 not because of some, rational calculation like others attribute to him and Russia's geopolitical, I don't know what, and threat perception and NATO. And no, no, no. Putin really needs to provoke in order to be punished. And once he's punished, then he's happier. Right now, I think he's trying to provoke, 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 and he did not receive the punishment from Biden that Putin thinks he deserved. So now he's probably going to provoke again in order to receive that punishment, and that's the only time, the only way to make him calm down.
So, if Putin is actually seeking to be punished, what does that mean in terms of negotiating with him? What's a strategy that would work, and what's a strategy that would not work?
Very good question. In fact, Biden, I'd like to say, did the second worst thing he could have done handling Putin, because I believe, I don't see any evidence that Biden knew personally people with internalized homophobia growing up or in his life or in his political life. He might have dealt with them, but not so closely, because the way he reacted to Putin's multiple provocations was first to give him everything he wanted. And then when Putin invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Biden reacted by essentially drip, drip, drip to make Ukraine more or less viable, but not enough to defeat Russia. And that for Putin, I believe, was insulting. And the way the psychology tends to work. So all the while he was insulting Putin publicly. That's one of the worst things you can do with these people. And the way my mother counseled them, the way my father counseled them, you can't just say, why do you mean, why are you in so much trouble with your family, with your wife, with your bosses? You're always getting kicked out of your work. Why? Well, obvious, because you're doing this, you're doing that. No, you cannot talk to them like that. If the person comes in and says, well, I deserve special treatment because I'm, the reincarnation of Cleopatra, my mother would say something like, of course, Cleopatra, tell me now, why do you think you have so much trouble at work and with your wife? Oh, you think you're the victim? Of course you're the victim. Now keep telling me, because if you just recite the facts to them, especially in an aggressive way, first of all, that's not a good psychotherapist. And the guy's just going to walk out. He's going to walk out, as happens all the time. Oh, yeah, well, you're the enemy and you're conspiring with my wife and you're conspiring with my boss and whatever. So I'm out of here. And then you lose the chance of helping these people and helping their victims. So you have to kind of play along with their neurosis. Biden, again, did the second worst thing he could have done in dealing with a person suffering from internalized homophobia. Trump, on the other hand, Trump is following, I think, unconsciously. Let's see, because so far, I think Trump has unconsciously been following the correct way of dealing with somebody with internalized homophobia. You notice in his first term, he never spoke badly about Putin. He was always like, Putin, my friend, and Putin this. But he would speak badly publicly about all the other dictators of the world that he didn't like. He didn't think twice about hitting them. Whereas with Putin, no, 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 Putin with silk gloves. But at the same time, he punished Putin. He punished Putin with the Nord Stream sanctions. He, cajoled the Europeans to spend more on NATO and self-defense and all these things. And so Trump sanctioned several oligarchs close to Putin. So he did exactly what you should be doing to handle somebody with that type of neurosis. And I always wondered, how did Trump learn to do things like this? And the answer came one day when I was talking to my great friend Dick Morris, who just happens to be one of Trump's, campaign managers, whatever, for all three campaigns, by the way. And I know Dick since Mexico times when he helped us with Vicente Fox back in 2000, and I was senior advisor on foreign relations for the Vicente Fox campaign. And Dick and I have been great friends ever since. And I would send him, my papers, draft papers on Putin's psychology, because Dick is like a Renaissance man. He's incredibly knowledgeable about several topics, and I really, seek his input. And Dick Morris told me something very interesting. He said, "Well, this is exactly like my cousin Roy Cohn." And I'm like, "Who's Roy Cohn?" He's like, "What do you mean you don't know who Roy Cohn is?" He's, you cannot understand Trump without knowing who Roy Cohn is. So Roy Cohn, of course, later became famous because they made movies about him. But Roy Cohn, as you know, was Trump's lawyer from the 70s, mid 70s, until he died of AIDS in 1986. And he also suffered from internalized homophobia. And so I believe that, Trump dealing with Roy Cohn on a constant basis and the influence that Roy Cohn had on Trump. So Trump obviously knew how to, the neurosis and the challenges and the psychopathologies of a person suffering from internalized homophobia. And he probably senses that in Putin. I don't know, but it's just a theory. Maybe one day he'll confirm it. He obviously cannot say so in public. Now, also, Trump, now that he's back in the White House, how is he going to handle Putin? Maybe something happened in the meantime that he totally changed. Sometimes he makes these statements that send really chills through make my blood, kind of like ice. I feel ice running through my veins when he talks about what he's going to give Putin and Ukraine and things like that. And of course, everybody jumps to conclusions. He must have sold off to Putin, whatever. I still give him a little bit of benefit of the doubt. I don't think Trump would have appointed people like Marco Rubio or Keith Kellogg to these positions if he was planning to sell out Ukraine just like that. I think he's playing a game with Putin because Trump understands Putin's psychology. But again, we don't know, Jason. It's all, we're going to, as usual, Russia is always going to confound us.
So, Russia, a country you spent decades studying, there was a point in time where it was not the Putin dictatorship. And in fact, there's a lot of hope. A lot of people thought that Russia would become a normal European country with a liberal democracy. And throughout the 90s, a lot of people really believed that, and actually through the early 2000s. But at some point or another, Russia took the wrong turn, and it's become the authoritarian, genocidal dictatorship that it is today. So, where do you think it made the wrong move?
Absolutely. We could talk 10 hours about this. I've dedicated my life studying this. I have known the players. But what I can say, executive summary wise, is that it was not inevitable. And I'll give you a very concrete example of how different things could have turned out in Russia. One of the chief contenders to succeed Boris Yeltsin was my very good friend, rest in peace, Gennady Eduardovich Burbulis. And apparently, somewhere I read that because of his Lithuanian surname, his grandfather came from Lithuania, he was not chosen as Boris Yeltsin's vice president. Instead, he chose his former military guy named Rutskoy. You remember him, who later, betrayed him, whatever. But Burbulis was Yeltsin's right hand man, and he was there through thick and thin in the Congress of People's Deputies, the Supreme Soviet, and all the battles, and then the dissolution of the Soviet Union was actually signed by 6 people, and Burbulis and Yeltsin were representing the Russian side. Now, fast forward, when I found out that another great friend of ours, another signer of the Bielovesia Accords, Stanislav Stanislavovich Shushkevich, who was president of Belarus, or the accidental, head of state of Belarus when the Bielovesia, and he signed it on Belarusian territory. It was signed on Belarusian territory, as you know. When he passed away in 2022, I believe it was May, immediately I called Burbulis, and he had already heard the news. And in fact, just talking about Shushkevich, both of us were literally in tears. We're crying, like kids. And so when little anecdotes like that, Jason, tell me that if he had that Lithuanian surname on his mother's side and not his father's side, and a total accident of history, and he would have become Yeltsin's vice president and deputy prime minister and all this and succeeded Yeltsin, Russia would be an entirely different country today. I don't believe in this sort of inevitability. Yeltsin did, however, make one huge mistake. Well, many mistakes, but the biggest one. And in fact, Burbulis kept telling him, we need to uproot. The word he used in Russian is beautiful. Vykorchivats. We need to uproot the KGB. and its legacy, because otherwise Russia will never be able to recover from its totalitarian past. And Yeltsin brushed him aside, said, Gennady Eduardovich, you're crazy. We cannot dissolve the KGB. The KGB is good. It solves problems. I want it as my sort of toy against, his enemies, whatever. In those days, it was not Zyuganov or whoever, but he did not dissolve the KGB. As we know, that disease stayed in Russia, but it could have easily been dissolved. Yeltsin, in fact, was about to dissolve it, and then at the last minute, he changed his mind. And so these little historical accidents, Jason, is what made someone like Putin, which was entirely predictable once we realized he was not going to reform the KGB after Bakatin, who spent 3 months heading the KGB and separating its different functions and trying to reform it. When he was fired, we knew that eventually the KGB would take over power. And in Demokratizacja, we published several articles that couldn't be published elsewhere because in those days it was considered heresy almost to talk about Russia heading in the wrong direction. I'm talking very early, 92, 93, 94. We published numerous articles by great scholars like Victor Yasmin and Mike Waller and others that were not exactly part of the established theory that Russia, was an teleological path, towards democracy. We knew something was going to happen. In fact, I helped organize these conferences in Russia called KGB Yesterday, Today, Tomorrow by the famed dissident Sergei Grigorians. And a lot of material came out, was published from those conferences. That's when you knew that the democracy in Russia was not going to last long, and we were right.
So, have you ever looked at Russia, though, in contrast to other countries that were developing or were on the road to democracy and somehow also got off on the wrong track?
Absolutely. And there's a whole tragic collection, Jason, of these. I made it, in fact, one of my life missions to train the future generations so they don't make the same mistake. In fact, at our Kasla Institute based in Prague, we have these grants from the Czech Foreign Ministry to train all these Latin American young activists from the troubled countries, places like Cuba, Venezuela, in those days, Ecuador, when Correa was there in Ecuador, as well as Nicaragua, of course, so that when the time comes, because the liberation will come, and hopefully, the right people will be at the right moment, to take over power. It happens. And then guess what? They sit on it. They don't know what to do. They contemporize. They don't listen to people like Gennady Burbulis, who says you need to do these reforms. They say, like, no, those things will take care of themselves. And then before you know it, the country relapses into dictatorship. So I put together books. I have a 9-hour, YouTube lesson, I guess, in 9, 10 different chapters on how to do a transition from a one-party regime. See, it's much easier to do a transition from a military junta and like an Argentina style or whatever, those are easy. But the one-party regime poses several challenges. And so Mexico, Nicaragua, Cuba, are one-party regimes, and those obviously need to be dealt with different. And in Mexico, they didn't know how to deal with them, despite me yelling to all my campaign people who eventually, became part of the Mexican new establishment. They did a horrible transition. And that's one of the reasons why Mexico relapsed into a one-party regime. It was entirely predictable. And I published this in many places. If you want to see just one example, you can Google the national interest. Back in 2003, they published my article called Mexico's Wasted Chance. Vicente Fox repeated a lot of the same mistakes that Yeltsin made. But of course, the stakes were much lower in Mexico, less noticeable. The collapse of that chance was much less noticeable. Mexico is, of course, not an aggressive nuclear superpower as Russia. I just hope that when Russia has its liberation again, because, Russia will have a liberation again, the democratic forces of Russia would have learned from the mistakes of the, 91, 92, 93.
So that's an interesting nexus. Let's talk about Russia in Latin America. What is Russia's interest or role in Latin America today and in the Soviet period? Has it changed?
A troublemaker. The Soviet Union, of course, we know the history in Latin America. Mexico would have been the crown jewel of a Soviet takeover. In fact, but the Mexican political police was way too smart for that. They coordinated very closely with the CIA, even though they made the Soviets think that they were, pro Cuba, and Mexico was fertile ground for revolution and all that. I learned that, in fact, from the former KGB director in Mexico. His name was Nechiporyanko, Oleg Nechiporyanko, who I met by chance in Moscow. Spoke Spanish like a Mexican. I mean, fluent, even with the facial expressions and stuff. And he famously got expelled back in, the 70s for trying to organize revolution and stuff. I mean, Mexico was very tough against Soviet infiltration. But of course, Cuba had its revolution, which was not for communism. That was betrayed. If you look at figures like Uber Matos or Camilo Cienfuegos, they were fighting for genuine democracy, liberation, sort of independence from the Yankee or from, Cuba was very late in its independence from Spain, and that always left scars. But then it was hijacked by the Castro brothers, who then turned to the Soviet Union, and that was a very tragic thing. It was all ideologically based. But now, trying to define why Russia's still messing with Latin America, I would say is just simply to create trouble in America's backyard. Maybe for the same reason that the Ukrainians went into Kursk in August to have a bargaining chip. The Russians, Putin would probably love to say, oh, okay, well, I give you Venezuela and Cuba, and I get out of Lourdes spy station in Cuba in exchange for, you name it, in Europe, in my own backyard. A lot of what Russians do, again, and what Putin does, as I mentioned earlier, is more based on his sort of twisted psychology rather than any geopolitical calculation. But if Putin is surrounded by what they call geostrategists, that's what they would be doing. Okay, mess around in Venezuela and sign yet another eternal friendship agreement with them, sell them weapons, give them intelligence, whatever, cause all the trouble you can for the Americans, and then say, oh, guess what? Me, beautiful Russia, if you accept me as your sort of second powerful country in the world, and we govern the world together, because again, Russia has its own neurosis, unfortunately, then I will give you Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua and things like that. I think it's just for bargaining chip purposes, troublemaking, and making a little money for some, crooked elites in Moscow. I don't think it goes beyond that.
So it's interesting that we mentioned the Maduro regime in Venezuela specifically. And I think it's actually sort of interesting the state actors with whom Russia works, but also the non state actors. We look at the relationship that Moscow maintains with Hezbollah, Hamas, and terrorist organizations. And we know very well that the Maduro regime in Venezuela is allied and works very closely with drug cartels. So it's sort of incredible. The criminal underbelly works as well with terrorist organizations that work with state actors. And all of them work against the US's interest as well as Europe's. But going ahead, knowing all this, acknowledging all this, I think that many people get wrong. They think that Russia's war in Ukraine is the essence of Russia. But in fact, Russia's essence is against the West. And what it's seeking to do is against the West as a whole, Ukraine being part of a much, much bigger picture. What would you say?
I think that's correct. I think that Putin initially, and this goes back to my theory as to why this entire war in Ukraine is not exactly rational. This whole anti-Western thing, the rhetoric by Putin is not rational. It's all a reaction to feeling rejected by the West. Because you remember Putin 1.0, who had people like Andrei Ilarionov counseling him on economic reforms. They did the flat tax. They did those incredible sovereign funds that grew like crazy when the oil price went up. Putin was doing everything right in the economic sphere, of course. He did a lot of things that poor Yegor Gaidar couldn't do because of the parliament. Putin couldn't care less about those restraints. He just signed decrees, and Russia started booming. And then he gave that beautiful speech to the Bundestag where he claimed that, in German, that Russia is part of the West. And, I get the feeling that, again, knowing the psychology of these people and how they would react to even the most slightest, sort of slight, to put it that way, to feeling that I gave you everything. I came crawling on my knees with flowers and you didn't even answer me. You didn't answer the door. Well, I told you I was busy. And so you suddenly become their number one enemy. And again, my parents counsel people like this all the time, and they vow to destroy you. In fact, I just by chance also I have here my father, 1997 book precisely on these things, where he discovered also an additional little nugget of wisdom that poison is a big deal with people that suffer from internalized homophobia. It all fits together. So I believe Putin, thought that the West would say, "Oh, I love you so much, and I'm going to make you my number two, and we cannot live without Russia, and Russia can do whatever it wants in its backyard, and is going to be our, almost like that character in Notes from Underground from Dostoevsky, the underground man, and how he relates to the officer." People who know literature, I always say, well, that's Putin, the underground man. And the officer is the West. And the officer just ignores the underground man because it's only 2% of the world economy. And it's, whatever. But Putin felt slighted. At some point, he decided he was going to turn against the West and gave that famous Munich speech in 2007. But fast forward, Jason, and notice something very interesting. The masochism again comes forth fully blown. He declared war against Ukraine. And then when things were not going well, he said, well, it's all against the West and the Western values and Western concepts and America, and it's all fascism. Well, he had close to $300 billion of sovereign assets in the capital of NATO, Brussels. Now, if he was a real geostrategic thinker, he would have said, well, I'm going to invade Ukraine. But first, I need to get my house in order. I need to get that money back to Russia or to a friendly country like China and deposit it there. He left in the enemy's hands $300 billion, which leads me to believe Putin is not a geostrategist. He just acts out of anger. And the Ukraine invasion, he probably decided that just by himself. You remember that meeting that he organized in the Kremlin, and his top advisors were several meters away from him in that big white hall. And even they didn't know what he was planning because he kept quizzing them. And they were saying, and these are the most senior Russian officials, and he humiliated them in public by saying, on live television, by saying, no, that's not what we're going to do. Obviously, things like that. So I get the feeling Putin decided just on a whim to invade Ukraine because of a slight that he felt the West gave him. And the more rhetoric against the West and this, while leaving $300 billion in the capital of the West, at least the eastern part of the West, if you can call it that, Brussels. So no, Putin unfortunately is governed by these laws in his head, and yet even more unfortunately, my co-author in this study of Vladimir Putin, J. Michael Waller, he's been affiliated with the CIA since the 80s, since the Central American Wars. And of course, he's had a lot of access to the thinking of the CIA and generally the U.S. intelligence community and the psychology of Putin. He's never seen anything that would suggest that the CIA has ever forwarded this information to the leadership of the country. And I think it's not because they don't know, it's that they don't want to know. They think that if they forward something like this to the president, to the White House, they're going to get canceled, especially during Biden, So again, we're flying blind, Jason. That's the problem. We're flying blind.
So let me ask you one last question. If we look at all this, we understand this, we've laid out what would happen and how Putin would perceive if Trump were to act one way. But how about if Trump acted the other way? Instead of actually being tougher, let's imagine Trump just gave him what he wanted. How would Putin perceive that? Do you think that he would then become docile and say, I've won? Or where does that lead us?
Then God help us, Jason. If Trump is not following what I'm hoping still that he is following, remembering his Roy Cohn and other neurotics in New York that he dealt with very successfully over the years, and he knows how to deal with the Putin type. A lot of these gangsters that he dealt with in New Jersey while opening casinos and things like that, have huge egos and huge insecurities, just like Vladimir Putin. They probably also suffer from the same thing as Putin, as Roy Cohn did as well. If I'm wrong in this, Jason, then God help us, because then Putin will say, oh, he did not punish me. I kept provoking him so he can punish me. Me maltrata porque me quiere. And then guess what? He mistreats me because he loves me. Oh, he didn't mistreat me. I'm going to keep provoking until he mistreats me, because that's when he will feel love, quote unquote, in his very sick mind.
I would totally agree with you. Putin needs to be stopped. Fredo, it was great talking with you today.
Thank you, Jason. A pleasure.